"That's not how this dish works, ma'am," Daniel said, the corner of his mouth lifting just enough to be heard over the soft hum of a Friday night crowd. And for a split second, the room seemed to tilt toward that sound, toward the faint clink of crystal glasses and the low jazz drifting through the dim amber light. But Ava Williams didn't look up right away, her fingers resting lightly on the linen tablecloth as if she were feeling the texture of the evening itself, as if the air carried more information than the menu in front of her. And when she finally raised her eyes, they didn't challenge him, didn't harden. They simply observed, steady and quiet, like someone who had seen this exact moment unfold before, maybe 100 times, maybe more. And Daniel mistook that silence for uncertainty, for ignorance, for the kind of hesitation he had learned to correct quickly, efficiently, because in his world, knowledge had a uniform, and it didn't look like her, not here, not in a place where reservations ran 3 weeks out and the average check cleared $200 without wine. So he leaned in slightly, voice lowered but edged with confidence, explaining the dish again, each word polished, rehearsed, just a little too slow, like he was translating something simple into something simpler. And still Ava said nothing, her gaze drifting past him for a fraction of a second toward the open kitchen where flames licked the edges of steel pans and chefs moved in tight choreography, the sharp rhythm of knives tapping against cutting boards echoing like a distant metronome. And then, without a word, she reached for the folded napkin beside her glass of water, smooth and untouched. And with the pen she pulled from her bag, she began to write, not hurried, not hesitant, but precise, each line forming with the kind of certainty that didn't need to prove itself, while Daniel straightened, blinking once, unsure whether to be amused or annoyed. And when she finished, she slid the napkin across the table toward him with the smallest motion of her hand, her expression unchanged, and he glanced down, expecting something trivial, something off, something to confirm what he already believed. But as his eyes moved across the lines, his smile lingered a second too long, then shifted, barely, almost imperceptibly, before he let out a short laugh anyway, louder this time, enough for the couple at the next table to glance over, enough for another server to pause mid-step, and he held up the napkin like a joke he was about to share, calling a colleague over with a tilt of his head, the room beginning to notice, the soft conversations dimming just a notch, until, somewhere behind him, deeper in the glow of the kitchen lights, a figure stopped moving altogether, and for the first time that night, the rhythm of the room broke. Daniel's laughter lingered in the air a moment too long, like a note played off-key, and the few people who had turned to watch did not turn away this time, their conversations softening into murmurs that hovered just beneath the music, while Ava remained exactly as she was, her hands now resting calmly in her lap, her posture unchanged, as if the attention shifting around her belonged to someone else entirely. And Daniel, still holding the napkin between his fingers, forced another chuckle as he read one line out loud to his colleague, mispronouncing a technique he barely understood, his tone light, but edged with something brittle, something defensive, because the handwriting was not casual, not guessed. It carried structure, sequence, intention, and that unsettled him in a way he could not quite name. So he leaned into the performance, turning slightly so others could see, inviting agreement, inviting laughter. But what came back was thinner than he expected, a few polite smiles, a raised eyebrow, a glance toward the kitchen where the movement had slowed just enough to be noticed. And Daniel felt it then, the subtle shift in temperature that had nothing to do with the air conditioning, the sense that the room was no longer following him, that something had slipped out of his control, and he cleared his throat, straightening his vest, about to say something sharper, something final, when a voice from behind him, quiet but precise, cut through the space with a clarity that did not need volume. "Let me see that," and it was not a request. Daniel turned, half expecting a manager, but the man standing there wore a chef's coat marked with the kind of detail that did not belong to the front of house. His sleeves rolled just enough to reveal the heat of the kitchen still clinging to his skin, and without waiting, he took the napkin from Daniel's hand, his eyes scanning the lines quickly, once, then again, slower this time, and the longer he looked, the more the room seemed to hold its breath, the faint sizzle from the kitchen suddenly louder, the soft jazz now distant, like it had stepped back to make room for something else. and Daniel felt a tightness form at the base of his neck, a quiet pressure building as he watched the chef's expression shift from neutral to something sharper. Not confusion, not dismissal, but recognition, and he laughed again, softer now, almost under his breath, as if trying to reclaim the moment before it fully slipped away. "It is just a guess," he said, though his voice did not carry the same certainty as before, and the chef did not respond right away, his gaze lifting slowly, not toward Daniel, but past him, toward Ava, who met his eyes without hesitation, and in that brief exchange, something passed between them that no one else in the room could quite read, something quiet and undeniable, and the chef's posture changed, just slightly, but enough, his shoulders settling, his attention shifting entirely. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, steadier, and directed not at the room, not at Daniel, but at her. "Where did you train?" And for the first time, Daniel felt the ground beneath the moment tilt in a direction he could not follow. The question did not echo loudly, but it landed with weight, settling into the space between them as the entire room seemed to lean closer without moving. And Ava did not answer right away, not because she did not have one, but because she chose the moment, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table as if grounding herself in something steady, something familiar, while Daniel stood just a step behind the chef, suddenly aware of the distance between where he thought he stood and where he actually was, his earlier confidence thinning into something quieter, something uncertain, and Ava finally lifted her chin just slightly, her voice calm, measured, carrying no need to impress. "I trained in places where mistakes cost more than pride," she said, and it was not defensive, not dramatic, just a statement that hung in the air with a quiet gravity, and the chef's eyes narrowed just a fraction, not in doubt, but in recognition of the way she chose her words, the way she did not name institutions or cities or accolades, as if those details mattered less than the discipline behind them. And for a moment, no one spoke. The only sound, the soft crackle from the kitchen and the distant hum of refrigeration units blending into a low, steady rhythm. And then the chef looked back down at the napkin, tracing one of the lines with his finger, almost unconsciously, as if confirming what he already knew. And Daniel shifted his weight, his hands now empty, unsure where to place them. His mind replaying the moment he laughed, the way it sounded, the way it felt so certain then and so misplaced now. And he tried to find something to say, something to re-enter the conversation, but the words did not come with the same ease. They lingered just out of reach, and Ava, sensing the shift without looking at him, leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture relaxed but composed, as if the tension in the room had never belonged to her in the first place. And the chef exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried both respect and realization, before asking, softer now, "Why here?" And it was a different question, not about credentials, not about training, but about presence, about why someone who wrote like that, who saw like that, would sit alone at a table like this and order something so simple. And Ava's gaze moved briefly toward the open kitchen again, watching a young cook adjust a pan, correcting the heat by instinct rather than instruction, and she allowed the smallest hint of a smile to touch her lips. "Because sometimes the simplest dish tells you everything about a place," she said, and this time, the words settled differently, not as a challenge, not as a correction, but as an invitation to see what had been overlooked. And the chef nodded once, slowly, his expression no longer guarded, no longer testing, but open, almost deferential. And somewhere in the room, a glass was set down just a little too carefully, a chair shifted with deliberate quiet, as if the entire space had collectively decided to listen more closely. And Daniel felt it fully then, the reversal not announced, not declared, but unfolding in the smallest details, in the way the chef stood, in the way the room watched, in the way Ava remained exactly who she had been from the start, unchanged, while everything else adjusted around her. The air did not move the same way anymore. It thickened, like every sound had to pass through something heavier before reaching the ear, and the chef straightened slowly, still holding the napkin between his fingers as if it carried more weight than paper should, his gaze lingering on Ava for a second longer before he turned his head slightly toward the kitchen, not fully breaking eye contact, but enough to signal something had shifted behind the scenes. And within seconds, a subtle chain reaction followed, a line cook stepping back, another adjusting his stance, the quiet choreography tightening as if the entire kitchen had just been given a new standard to meet. And Daniel noticed it, not with clarity, but with the uneasy feeling that something important had moved beyond him, like a conversation continuing in a language he did not speak. And he cleared his throat again, softer now, trying to reclaim a sense of place. "Sir, I can have the kitchen prepare something else if the guest is not satisfied," he said, the words formal, practiced, but lacking the certainty they once held, and the chef did not look at him immediately, which somehow felt louder than any correction, and when he finally did, it was brief, measured, not unkind, but firm in a way that did not invite interruption. "No," he said quietly, then turned back to Ava, his voice shifting again, lower, more deliberate. "Would you allow us to prepare it your way?" And the question did not sound like a challenge. It sounded like respect wrapped carefully in restraint, and Ava paused, just long enough to acknowledge the weight of what had been offered, her eyes flicking once more toward the open kitchen where the heat shimmered above the stove tops, and the scent of butter and herbs drifted faintly into the dining room, and she nodded. A single, simple motion, not dramatic, not hesitant, just acceptance, and the chef exhaled through his nose, almost like relief, before turning fully toward the kitchen this time, his voice cutting cleanly through the space with quiet authority, calling out instructions that did not need repetition, and immediately the rhythm changed. Pans lifted, flames adjusted, movements sharpened, not chaotic, but focused, intentional, and the energy in the room followed, conversations dropping just enough for people to listen without admitting they were listening, while Daniel stepped back instinctively, his role suddenly unclear, his hands clasping behind his back as if searching for structure, and he watched, unable to look away, as the dish he had described so confidently just minutes ago began to be rebuilt from the ground up, each step slower, more precise, guided not by routine, but by something deeper, something he could not quite name, and Ava remained still, her gaze steady, not supervising, not correcting, simply witnessing, as if she trusted the process more than the outcome, and that, more than anything, unsettled him. Because for the first time that night, Daniel realized the room was no longer responding to him. It was responding to her, to the quiet authority she never raised her voice to claim, to the presence she never announced. And in that realization, the distance between who he thought she was and who she actually was stretched wider than he knew how to cross. Time stretched in a way that made every second feel deliberate, the kind of slow, quiet tension that builds not from noise but from precision, and Daniel found himself standing at the edge of it, no longer part of the rhythm, just watching as the kitchen moved with a focus he had never really noticed before, not like this, not with this level of care. And the dish he once described so casually now existed as a sequence of exact decisions. Each step measured, each movement intentional, the chef guiding without raising his voice, correcting with a glance, adjusting with the smallest shift of a hand, and the line cooks responded instantly, like they understood something unspoken had raised the standard in the room, and the scent began to change too. Deeper now, richer, layers of butter warming slowly, herbs releasing their oils at just the right moment, the faint citrus note cutting through at the end, and even the guests could sense it, their conversations thinning into quiet curiosity, forks pausing midair, glasses held just a second longer before being set down, and through it all, Ava remained still, her presence neither demanding nor retreating, simply anchored, as if she had seen this process unfold countless times, and that calmness carried a weight that Daniel could not ignore, because it was not passive, it was assured, and he shifted again, his posture tightening, his mind racing through everything he had said, every assumption he had made, and none of it fit anymore, none of it aligned with what was happening in front of him. And when he glanced toward the chef, he noticed something else, something small but unmistakable, the way the chef occasionally looked back toward Ava, not for approval exactly, but for alignment, as if her presence alone had become a reference point. And that realization pressed into Daniel's chest with a quiet force, because it meant the authority in the room had moved. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, and he swallowed, the dryness in his throat sudden and unfamiliar. As the final steps came together, the plate assembled with a level of care that felt almost ceremonial. Every element placed with intention, every detail refined. And when the chef finally stepped back, he did not announce it, did not call attention to the moment. He simply nodded once. A signal understood by everyone in the kitchen, and the dish was lifted, carried forward with steady hands into the dining room where the light seemed just a little softer now, the air just a little quieter, and Daniel instinctively stepped aside, not instructed, not corrected, but knowing without being told that this moment did not belong to him. And as the plate was set gently in front of Ava, the subtle steam rising, catching the warm glow above the table, there was no applause, no reaction spoken out loud, just a silence that felt fuller than anything that had come before. And for the first time that night, Daniel realized that what he had mistaken for simplicity at the start was never simple at all. It was clarity. It was mastery stripped of the need to impress. And standing there, just a few feet away, he felt the quiet weight of that understanding settle in, heavier than any words he could find to explain it. The plate rested between them, quiet, composed, its warmth rising in soft, steady waves that caught the glow of the overhead light. And for a moment, no one moved, not the guests nearby, not the staff, not even Daniel, who stood just behind and to the side, his breath slower now, more measured, as if the room itself had taught him how to listen. And Ava's gaze lowered to the dish, not with anticipation, not with doubt, but with a kind of recognition that did not need words, her hand lifting gently, fingers steady as she picked up the fork, the faint metallic sound almost too soft to hear against the hush that had settled over the space. And as she cut into the dish, the texture responded exactly as it should, yielding without resistance, holding its structure, releasing a subtle aroma that drifted upward in a delicate balance. And she paused for a fraction of a second before tasting, not to build suspense, but to complete the moment with intention. And when she did, her expression did not change immediately, not in a way anyone could easily read, her eyes closing just slightly, not for effect, but as if aligning her senses with memory, with expectation, with something deeper than the room around her. And Daniel watched, unable to look away, his earlier certainty replaced by a quiet tension that sat low in his chest, because he understood now that this moment carried more weight than anything he had said before. And the seconds stretched, the room holding its breath again, waiting not for approval, but for truth. And when Ava finally opened her eyes, there was no dramatic reaction, no sudden shift, just a slow, almost imperceptible exhale, and the smallest nod followed, not exaggerated, not performative, but real. And that single motion moved through the space like a signal, the chef catching it first, his shoulders easing just slightly, the tension in his posture releasing in a way that spoke louder than any praise. And the kitchen behind him seemed to breathe again, movement resuming, but softer now, more grounded, as if something important had been confirmed. And Daniel felt it too, that shift, that release. But it did not bring relief to him, not fully, because with it came the clarity of everything he had misunderstood. And he lowered his gaze for a moment, his hands clasped tighter behind his back, the weight of his earlier laughter now settling into something quieter, something heavier. And when he looked up again, Ava had already set her fork down, her posture unchanged, her presence still calm, still steady, as if nothing about this moment had surprised her at all. And that was what stayed with him, more than the dish, more than the silence, more than the attention of the room. It was the way she carried the outcome without needing to claim it, the way she allowed the moment to exist without expanding it. And standing there, just a few feet away, Daniel realized that what he had witnessed was not just skill, not just precision, but something far more difficult to recognize, something that did not announce itself until it was already undeniable. And in that quiet understanding, the space between who he thought he was and who he needed to become felt wider than it had ever been before. The nod lingered in the air longer than anyone expected, not because it demanded attention, but because it quietly settled something that had been uncertain just moments before. And the chef straightened fully now, his posture no longer guarded, no longer testing, but resolved. And he stepped forward with a level of respect that did not need to be announced, his voice low, carrying only as far as it needed to. "Thank you," he said, not as a formality, but as an acknowledgement of something real. and Ava met his gaze with the same calm steadiness she had carried from the beginning, her expression unchanged, as if gratitude was simply another part of the process, not the conclusion of it. And around them, the room began to breathe again, conversations slowly returning, though softer now, more measured, as if everyone had learned something without being told what it was, and Daniel stood still, the quiet hum of the restaurant settling back into place around him. But it no longer felt the same, the edges of his awareness sharper now, the details more defined, and he glanced once more at the plate, then at Ava, then at the chef, the sequence of moments replaying in his mind with a clarity that left little room for denial. And he took a small step forward, almost instinctively, his voice hesitant at first, not because he did not know what to say, but because he finally understood the weight of saying it correctly. "Ma'am," he began, the words softer than before, stripped of its earlier tone. "I was wrong." And the admission did not echo, did not draw attention, but it carried enough presence to reach her. And Ava looked at him then, fully, her gaze steady, not sharp, not dismissive, just present. And Daniel felt it, the absence of judgment in her expression, the absence of any need to respond to his mistake with anything more than acknowledgement, and that unsettled him more than anger would have, because it left him alone with the truth of his own actions, unchallenged, unhidden, and he swallowed, continuing, "I made an assumption I should not have made." And the words came slower now, each one chosen, each one deliberate, and Ava held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not as acceptance, not as forgiveness declared, but as recognition, the kind that allowed the moment to exist without expanding it into something larger. And Daniel exhaled quietly, a breath he did not realize he had been holding, and stepped back, the space between them no longer defined by tension, but by understanding. And the chef, observing this without interruption, gave a slight incline of his head, as if marking the end of something that had needed to be said, and the rhythm of the restaurant continued, the kitchen returning to its steady pace, the soft music filling in the spaces that had been held by silence. And yet something remained, something subtle but lasting, carried in the way the staff moved with just a little more awareness, the way the guests spoke with just a little more care, and Daniel, standing once more at his position, felt it most clearly, not as a lesson spoken out loud, but as a shift he could not undo, a quiet understanding that what he had witnessed was not simply a correction of a dish, but a correction of perspective, one that would follow him long after the plates were cleared and the lights dimmed. And as he glanced one last time toward Ava, he saw that she had already returned to her meal, her focus calm, her presence unchanged, as if none of it had been about proving anything at all, and that, more than anything, stayed with him. The moment passed without ceremony, as if the room itself had decided that nothing more needed to be said out loud, and Ava continued her meal with the same quiet focus she had carried from the beginning, each movement deliberate, unhurried, her attention resting fully on the plate before her, while around her the restaurant resumed its rhythm, though softer now, more aware, as if every conversation carried an undercurrent of what had just unfolded. And Daniel returned to his station, but not in the same way he had stood there before, his posture more measured, his gaze more attentive, noticing details he had overlooked countless times, the way a guest hesitated before ordering, the way a colleague adjusted a plate just slightly before serving, the way the kitchen breathed in steady cycles of heat and motion. And it all felt different now, not louder, not brighter, but clearer, as if something had been stripped away, leaving only what mattered. And from across the room, the chef watched for a moment longer before stepping back toward the kitchen, his pace unhurried, his presence still carrying that quiet authority, but now it was grounded in something deeper, something shared rather than imposed. And when he reached the threshold of the open kitchen, he paused briefly, turning his head just enough to look back at Ava one last time, not to check, not to confirm, but to acknowledge. And she gave the slightest nod in return without lifting her eyes from the plate, a small exchange that held no need for recognition beyond itself. And Daniel saw it, the ease of it, the absence of performance, and it settled into him in a way he could not ignore, because it showed him what confidence looked like when it did not need to be proven. And as the evening continued, he found himself moving differently, speaking with more care, listening with more intention, each interaction shaped by the quiet understanding that had taken hold of him. And when Ava finally set her fork down and reached for her glass, the last of the dish gone, the moment did not draw attention, but it was noticed, not in a dramatic way, but in the subtle shift of eyes, in the slight pause of movement, as if the room recognized that something complete had just come to rest, and Daniel approached her table once more. Not with the same certainty as before, but with something steadier, something earned, his voice low, respectful. "Was everything to your liking?" he asked, the question simple, but this time it carried no assumption, only openness, and Ava looked up at him, her gaze calm, her expression unchanged, and she gave a small, genuine nod. "It was," she said, and that was all, no elaboration. No need to expand the moment beyond what it was, and Daniel accepted it with the same quiet understanding, stepping back without lingering, without trying to fill the space with more words, because he understood now that not every moment required them. And as Ava reached for her bag and stood, smoothing her dress with a natural ease, the light catching briefly on the subtle detail of the fabric, there was no rush, no urgency, just a steady movement toward the exit. And as she walked past the open kitchen, the chef gave a slight incline of his head. A gesture returned with the faintest glance, and then she continued forward, the door opening softly to the night beyond, and for a brief second, the cool air from outside drifted in, carrying with it the distant sounds of the city before the door closed. Again, leaving the warmth of the restaurant intact, but changed, and Daniel stood there, watching the space where she had been, understanding that while the evening would continue, something within him had already shifted into something new, something he would carry forward long after the last table was cleared. The door closed with a soft click that barely rose above the music, yet it marked something final, something complete, and for a moment, Daniel remained still, his eyes lingering on the reflection in the glass where Ava had just passed through, the faint outline already fading into the night beyond, while inside, the warm glow of the restaurant continued as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had, just beneath the surface. In the way the air settled, in the way the staff moved with a quiet awareness that had not been there before, and Daniel slowly turned back toward the dining room, the polished floor catching the light in long, steady lines. Each step he took measured without him realizing it, as if his body had learned something his mind was still catching up to, and he reached his station again, his hands resting lightly against the edge of the counter, feeling the cool surface beneath his fingertips, grounding himself in the present, while his thoughts replayed the evening not as a sequence of events, but as a shift in perspective, a recalibration of something deeper than routine. And he glanced toward the kitchen where the chef had already returned to his work, the steady rhythm of pans and flames continuing, but now carrying a subtle difference, a sharper focus, a quieter respect woven into every motion. And Daniel noticed how the chef paused once, just briefly, adjusting a plate with the same precision Ava had written into that napkin, as if her presence had left behind more than a moment, as if it had left behind a standard. And Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath steady, his shoulders easing in a way they had not earlier that night. And as the next guest approached, menu in hand, he met them with a different kind of attention, not scanning, not assuming, but listening, truly listening, his voice softer, more deliberate, each word chosen with care, and the interaction unfolded differently, smoother, more grounded, not because he tried to perform better, but because something in him had shifted into alignment with what he had witnessed. And across the room, a glass caught the light just right, reflecting a brief shimmer across the wall, a small detail that might have gone unnoticed before, but now held his attention for a second longer, reminding him how much had been there all along, waiting to be seen. And as the evening moved forward, table by table, order by order, Daniel carried that awareness with him, not as a burden, but as a quiet responsibility, something he did not speak about, something he did not need to. And near the end of the night, as the crowd thinned and the music softened, he found himself standing again in the same place where it had all begun, the same table now cleared, the linen smooth and untouched, the chair neatly aligned. And he reached out, almost unconsciously, adjusting the edge of the tablecloth just slightly, the fabric falling into place with a quiet precision. and he paused there for a moment, his hand resting lightly against the surface, before stepping back, the reflection of the room stretching across the polished glass behind him. And in that reflection, he saw not just the space, but the shift within it, subtle, steady, and lasting, like a note that continues long after it has been played. And though the night would end, and the doors would close, and the lights would dim, he understood now that what had changed would not fade with it. It would remain, carried forward in every choice, every word, every moment where he chose to see before deciding, to listen before speaking. And as he turned to finish his work, the quiet of the room settled fully,